Last time, we saw that MacIntyre in chapter 4 is trying to recommend Thomistic Aristotelianism to us as a viable ethical theory for our own modern era. And it's not merely viable. It provides a needed theoretical perspective that can help to clarify the nature of the conflicts within the modern practical identity. It's a kind of hermeneutic as well as an ethical theory. These conflicts within the modern identity were shown to be between a self that needs to think of itself in terms of the dominant social order of institutionalized capitalism, on the one hand, and on the other hand, a self that pursues common goods and excellence within the context of other human practices that still fall outside, thankfully, the capitalist system, for now at least. However, this conception is best seen as a competition between two rival conceptions of rationality. So we have on the one hand the economic conception of practical rationality that flows from the ethics of the capitalist state and the capitalist market, and the conception of practical rationality that is articulated in the older tradition of Aristotelian Thomism. So last time we ended with an examination of the conception of practical rationality according to the dominant standpoint. Next, MacIntyre turns to the contrasting conception of Thomistic Aristotelianism. So, section 5, practical rationality from a Neo-Aristotelian standpoint. An initial contrast between the Neo-Aristotelian account of practical reason and the economic account is that in the Neo-Aristotelian account, the conclusion of practical reason is conceived as an action. The conclusion of a practical deduction, a piece of practical reasoning, is not a decision, but rather it is an action. Reasoning, from this perspective, does not have to be an explicit rehearsal of reasons. The premises of a piece of practical reasoning are the truthful answer that the practical reasoner would give to the question, why did you act as you did? These premises thus mention the ends for which the agent acts. In MacIntyre's example of the person who immediately breaks off, interrupts a conversation with a friend in order to save an endangered child, is an example of reasoning for Aristotelian, although normally we wouldn't say, of course, this person was sitting there rehearsing their reasons to themselves or deliberating in some sort of methodical, self-conscious way. But the reasoning is embodied, as it were, in the disposition, in this case, the virtuous disposition of the person who knows the proper rank ordering of, let's say, a conversation with a friend and the life of a child, and has that disposition ingrained in them so that they immediately act in that way. But so the ends are crucial to the formulation of the premises in a deductive argument leading to an action. The ends are selected by an agent based upon how they distinguish real from apparent goods, and this in turn depends upon their ability to make this distinction, which hinges on their virtues and vices. And all of this, of course, is familiar from our earlier examination of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Hence, agents do not have to rehearse their reasons or deliberate in the moment of action because they already have formed dispositions to act in certain ways that are embodied in their virtues. They've formed disposition to act in certain ways for the sake of certain recognized goods in certain circumstances. However, reflection on what is truly good and the rank ordering of goods, as well as how to pursue the goods in various types of situation, will typically have gone into the forming of these dispositions. A crucial aspect of Thomistic Aristotelian reasoning is the belief, quoting MacIntyre here, that there are standards independent of our feelings, attitudes, and choices, which determine what is and is not good, and that rationality requires an acknowledgement of the authority of those standards. So this is the crucial difference between the standpoint of economic rationality, which all hinges on the agent's subjective preferences, and the standpoint of Thomistic Aristotelianism. The Thomistic Aristotelian is going to acknowledge standards independent of their feelings, attitudes, choices, and preferences. The standards are what they conform their preferences to if they are virtuous, and only if they are virtuous. It's the standards that determine what is good. A prerequisite of engaging in this kind of practical reasoning, therefore, is a certain type of understanding of one's life. A certain type of understanding of one's life, that one must understand oneself as someone whose life is made intelligible in terms of the achievement of individual and common goods. This is a counterpart to the type of understanding of one's life that characterizes the economic type reasoner, who sees his life in terms of seeking maximum preference satisfaction. So for the preference satisfier, the economic reasoner that characterizes the dominant standpoint of the capitalist culture, I seek to, at every moment in my life, maximize my preferences as much as I can at that moment. And of course, making provision for the future as well. I try to maximize the overall satisfaction of my preferences over the course of my life, perhaps weighing in the balance the probabilities of me living to a certain age and how much I should save for the future based upon the probability of my continuing to live at that age versus satisfy my preferences now, and so on. But it's always focused on this idea of preference satisfaction. At the end of one's life, one wants to be able to look back and say, I satisfied all of my desires, and if not all of them, as many of them as possible. Whereas from the Thomistic Aristotelian standpoint, one wants to understand oneself as living one's life in such a way as to fulfill one's potential for achieving individual goods and common goods. So it's a different perspective. Now, MacIntyre goes on to describe the various types of errors and dangers of error into which Thomistic Aristotelian practical reasoning can fall. Such reasoning proceeds from two types of premises. And this is very simple, straightforward. First type of premise would be those that identify the goods to be achieved and the evils to be avoided. The goods to be achieved and the evils to be avoided. That's pretty clear from what we've covered so far. And then also, I think equally clear, the premises that state the facts about how one is to act to achieve those goods and to avoid those evils. So premises about goods and premises about facts about how to achieve those goods. That's the way practical reasoning proceeds. I have to identify the goods and the evils in a particular situation, and I have to identify or be able to deliberate about the facts about how to achieve those goods. And this, again, is familiar from Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, or should be. However, it's possible to have true belief about the goods and the evils in a particular situation without taking into consideration all the goods and evils that may be involved. So one source of error for Thomistic Aristotelian in particular is a failure to think widely enough about these goods and evils for various reasons. Failure of imagination, lack of sensitivity to particular goods or evils, careless or inept assessments of the harms and dangers to be confronted, overconfidence in one's abilities, etc. And to this catalog, which are descriptive of things perhaps Aristotle and Aquinas could have been sensitive to, we would also add the effects of cognitive biases that psychology has warned us about. Such considerations set up for MacIntyre's major conclusion about practical deliberation. Namely, we need to enlist the help of others in our deliberation. And we've already seen this anticipated in what's gone before in this text. But practical deliberation, practical rationality from the Thomistic Aristotelian standpoint is not going to be some individual flying solo, isolating in their own mind what goods are worth being pursued and what evils are to be avoided, and the facts about how to pursue goods and to avoid evils. But also, we are going to enlist the help of others to identify those goods and to identify the best way to achieve those goods and also to avoid evils. Aristotle and Aquinas both knew that, to quote from Aristotle, where MacIntyre quotes from him on page 192, quote, "In important matters, we rely upon others, not relying upon ourselves for certitude. In important matters, we rely upon others, not relying on ourselves alone," the implication is, for certitude. So there are actually three reasons that a Thomistic Aristotelian will give for why we need to share practical deliberations with others. The first is cooperation is needed to achieve individual goods. So even for me to achieve my individual good, I need the help of others. Maybe I'm trying to write a book, and I need the help of an editor, a proofreader. Perhaps I need the help of other people to assist in, taking care of day-to-day needs while I'm in the thick of working on this book and I'm not able to, clean the house or pay the bills or whatever. I need to have someone to help me do these things. So there's cooperation that's needed to achieve individual goods. And so we'll want to be able to, convince other people of the good, or have them support our judgment of the good of whatever we're pursuing as our individual good, because we need their cooperation. We need to convince them, to enlist them to help us out. If someone thinks that this book I'm writing is worthless, they're probably not going to devote any time to proofreading it or editing it. So cooperation is needed to achieve individual goods. That's one reason we need to share our practical deliberations with others. A second is the need to share a common mind with others with whom we share common goods. So here, think about the example of the family, again, as the paradigm here of sharing common goods. If we are to pursue common goods with others, we have to have a common idea of what these common goods are. A marriage, for example, is unlikely to be successful if the idea of what the good of the marriage consists of varies widely between the two spouses, or nowadays maybe multiple spouses. So we need to share a common mind with others with whom we share common goods. And then third, and this is the big one, this is the one that MacIntyre particularly is emphasizing at this point in the text, is our fallibility, our liability to error as human beings. The human rational capacity is finite, it is fallible, it's liable to error, and so in matters that are important, we rely upon others, not just relying upon ourselves. We want to enlist others to share our practical deliberations, so to mitigate the chance that we're going to fall into some serious error, that we can be mutually correcting. And we saw in the previous video also examples that MacIntyre pointed to for why this is an important thing to do, to share our deliberations with others. There are two conditions that must be met in order to have fruitful joint deliberations with others. So first of all, we must, for the most part, agree with them about how individual and common goods are to be rank ordered in particular situations. This is sort of the character of the polis, or the society that Aristotle and Aquinas had hoped for or presumed as the ideal habitat for human beings. A society in which we can at least agree on the basic conception of what the common goods are and how they are to be rank ordered. And this requires, of course, a kind of shared culture in a rich, thick sense of culture. That's the first point. The second is that we must be able to accept criticism. That is, all the members of this deliberative body, whatever it might be, this advice group, as I was describing it last time, they must be able to accept criticism, even ruthless criticism. So you can't have people that are too touchy or sensitive or thin-skinned if we are to have fruitful practical deliberations with people. We have to be prepared to even ruthlessly, MacIntyre says, criticize others' perspective in order to arrive at a kind of shared consensus. So obviously these two are in tension with each other, these two conditions. On the one hand, we have to have broad-based agreement with others about how individual goods are to be rank ordered, but yet at the same time, we must be prepared to ruthlessly criticize each other. And you might say that it's only against the backdrop or in the background, against the background of this kind of shared, deep, common agreement that we are able to have trust that the ruthless criticism of one another, of course, in a charitable spirit, isn't going to destroy the relationship. And we see this at best, in disagreements among those who are very, strongly politically or religiously like-minded, or within families where there are deep bonds of love and affection, where they're able to have very, strong disagreements with each other, ruthless criticism, honest criticism, and at the same time, not destroy the bonds of society or friendship or relationship. And in that way, the deliberations are able to be fruitful, because it's not just a matter of groupthink, right? Which is the danger of if only the first condition were satisfied. If only we deliberated people with whom we had basic agreement and people were afraid of offending each other, you'd end up with groupthink. On the other hand, if you just had criticism without a shared background of agreement, you end up, of course, having just shouting matches and discord and breakdown. So you need to have both of those elements, the broad agreement about how individual and common goods are to be rank ordered in particular situations, and the willingness to accept criticism. Finally, Thomistic Aristotelian practical reasoning requires that the agent integrate the various goods. For example, the goods of home and workplace and school that we talked about last time, these various goods that the agent pursues. And the agent is able to or required to also define the role that they play in her life overall. So integrating the various goods is a requirement of practical reasoning, and having some fairly clear idea of the role that these various goods play in the overall life of the individual. And this requires a picture of one's life as a whole and the unity of that life. This is the idea of integrity. That is, that one wants one's life to have a kind of hanging together in its choices and its actions. And so one has to have a sense of how do these various goods that I'm pursuing and promoting, individual goods, common goods, in various areas of life, at home, at work, in the school, and other organizations that I might be a part of, how does all of this fit together? So we need to have some kind of way to form a picture of my life as a whole, the unity of my life. How does my life hang together as a whole? And MacIntyre describes this as follows. This is the bottom of 192 to the top of 193. For individuals cannot define or redefine their place in achieving the common goods of home, school, and workplace without also defining or redefining the place in their lives of those various goods through the achievement of which they direct themselves toward the good which would complete and perfect their lives. We go, that is, from asking, what is my good qua family member, qua student or teacher, qua apprentice in or master of this set of working skills, to asking, what is my good qua human agent? In answering this latter question, we decide how the various aspects and relationships of each role are to be integrated into a single life, and how the unity of that life is to be understood in terms of the various stages through which we pass between conception and death. Of any life which has come to an ending, or is about to come to an ending, whether our own or that of another, we can ask, what, if anything, makes this life, qua the life of a human being, significantly imperfect and incomplete? What is or was lacking in it which would have brought it to completion? To answer these questions is to have found application for the concept of a final end for human beings, and to have posed the problems about the relationship between our ends and our ending, but how we should tell the stories of lives that go well and lives that go badly. So this ultimate anchor for the process of practical reasoning for the Thomistic Aristotelian is going to be this idea of the final end of a human being, but then also this has to be applied to my own life. What is my life all about? Well, or if you're like MacIntyre, you're approaching the end of your life, you look back and you ask, what was my life all about? What was it all for? What was it all about? What was the final end of my life? And of course, my conception of what the final end of a human life is at every stage of my life, if I'm a Thomistic Aristotelian, going to be directing me towards, what I think the final end of my life should be. But then we have to ask ourselves also, how does this idea of there being an end to my life, a final end, an ultimate end, how does this fit together with all of the various goods, individual and common, in all of these various roles that I am pursuing? Does my life hang together? Does it have integrity? Or is it compartmentalized and at conflict with one another? So that at work, to take an extreme example, you can imagine a German father who's sweet and sentimental and kind with his wife and children, and then he puts on his, Nazi SS uniform and goes and works as a guard at a concentration camp during World War II. I mean, there are real life cases of this sort of compartmentalization. I think that's part of what MacIntyre is getting at here. How do we integrate these various roles in a way that gives our life a kind of integrity, where everything can be seen as building towards the completion of one's life? That's the Aristotelian perspective. So it's not a matter of just satisfying my preferences, even long term. Rather, it's a matter of achieving the good, achieving a kind of perfection, a completion of my life, kind of fulfillment, we could say, but in that sense of achieving those goods that make my life such that it can be seen as achieving or accomplishing some end. There is some end to my life that my life accomplished. That's the idea. At this point, MacIntyre switches to a discussion of happiness, or it would be better to say incorporates the discussion of happiness into this discussion of practical reasoning. And you can see the transition from the idea of the final end to the concept of happiness as a natural one. We're now at section 6, which is entitled The Dominant Conception of Happiness. The notion of the unity of a life and the final end is associated with the notion of happiness in the Thomistic Aristotelian tradition. And the concept of happiness also plays a central role in the dominant modern conception of what life is all about, the pursuit of happiness. And of course, it's central, for example, in Mill's utilitarianism, arguably the sort of paradigmatic modern ethical theory. So ancient and medieval theory and modern theory alike agree in the importance of happiness, the notion of happiness. But are the same notions of happiness involved in both cases? MacIntyre thinks not. First, there is the dominant conception of happiness, what he calls the dominant conception of happiness, the one that's taken for granted in all modern discussions, whether by psychologists, therapists, self-help gurus, economists, sociologists, politicians, advertisers. It's all the same. And this was the conception that was defined by professor of happiness studies at Erasmus University, Ruth Veenhoven, as the subjective appreciation of life, or a subjective appreciation of life. Happiness is understood to be a psychological state. A psychological state. This is the dominant conception of happiness. Happiness is a psychological state, namely the state of feeling good and wanting this feeling to continue. Happiness is finding one's life agreeable. So, happiness on the dominant modern conception is a state of only positive feelings. This is assumed in modern culture to be what everyone wants. On the modern conception, it's difficult for one to be deceived about being happy. One just needs to introspect and see, are you happy? Do you feel happy? If you feel happy, you are happy. If you feel a subjective appreciation of your life, if you have positive feelings when you reflect upon and contemplate your life, then you are happy. The best evidence that someone's happy is that they say they're happy, and they don't seem to be lying or insincere. That's what happiness is, on the dominant modern conception. Happiness is a state of only positive feelings, and this precludes anxiety, depressions, worries, fears, and so forth. So you're not happy if you have these negative feelings, only positive feelings. And it's taken by all to be a very great good, and by many to be identical with the good itself. So this is the dominant conception of happiness, the modern conception of happiness. Happiness as a state, that's a psychological state of having positive feelings, of finding one's life to be agreeable, of feeling that one's life is agreeable. Section 7, the Neo-Aristotelian critique of the dominant conception. The Thomistic Aristotelian response to this dominant modern conception of happiness is to first note the ways in which it makes sense to ask whether one has a reason to be happy. It makes sense to ask, in many cases, do you have a reason to be happy? So MacIntyre suggests the example of if you're happy that you passed the exam, you have a reason to be happy only if you actually did pass the exam, right? That's kind of an obvious case. So he's reminding us of obvious facts here, but facts that seem to be sort of ignored in the dominant modern conception. That is, it makes sense to ask, in most cases, whether you have a reason to be happy. And this is always the case when it comes to those objects that we say that we're happy with. Oftentimes, we're not just happy, but we're happy with something. We're pleased by something. We're satisfied by something. We're happy with something. I'm happy with the job I did. I'm happy with your behavior, son. I'm happy with, the way in which I was compensated for this work. I'm happy with this. I'm happy with that. So there are objects that we're happy with, or we express an intentional attitude, to use the philosophical term. Intentional meaning our attitude is directed towards something. It is possible, MacIntyre will later on acknowledge, that sometimes you just have a mood of happiness. So there is that possibility as well. But most of the time, I think it's fair to say we are happy with something. We're happy with some object. That is, there's an intentional attitude directed towards some object, and it makes sense to ask whether that attitude is justified or not. So apparently it can make sense to ask whether someone has a good reason to be happy. But what is it to have a good reason to be happy? Well, according to MacIntyre, two initial conditions are that first, the object must be as the person takes it to be. For example, I did pass the exam. The object is as I take it to be. So that's the first. And the second is that what I'm happy about must contribute to my good, or to the good of others about whom I have reason to care. What I'm happy about has to contribute to my good, or to the good of others about whom I have reason to care. So those are two initial conditions for having a good reason for being happy. The object that I'm happy with must be as I take it to be in order for me to have a good reason to be happy with it. For example, I actually did pass the exam. And second, what I'm happy about must contribute to my good or the good of others about whom I have reason to care. I mean, if, for example, I've just been victimized in some way, and I'm happy about it, we would say, well, you may be happy, but you don't have good reason to be happy. I mean, you were just taken advantage of. Why are you happy about that? Right? And we might suspect some kind of Stockholm syndrome or some kind of abused spouse, pathology of some kind in the person. We think may need some therapy or something, to get over this, right? Because you don't think they had a reason to be happy. And MacIntyre gives other examples. The example of the two types of student, the lazy wastrel and the unhappy perfectionist. In this connection, happiness, the connection between happiness and justification suggests that it makes sense also to ask in general whether it's good to be happy. And to explore this question, MacIntyre considers whether a teacher has reason to make her students happy. And he answers that it depends on the type of student. If the student's a lazy, happy wastrel, as he describes, then she has reason to make him unhappy. That is, if this is the kind of student who just does the minimum to get by and isn't rising to their potential because they're lazy, then the teacher has reason to make that student unhappy. Grade the student harder so the student will be motivated to actually rise to the challenge and develop their talents rather than just wasting them away. But on the other hand, if you have the kind of student who is a perfectionist, who's never made happy by anything, no matter how good they do, and they have a poor self-esteem, a bad opinion of themselves, well, in that case, the teacher has a reason to make this student happy. And this is clearly because it's bad for her to be unhappy. So it's bad for the former student, the lazy wastrel, to be happy, but it would be good for the latter student to be happy. Whether it's good or bad for a particular person to be happy, it depends upon, it seems, if you think about such cases, it depends upon the features of the person and their circumstances. The key question is whether he has a reason to be happy given those things. And this leads MacIntyre to conclude that it is good to be happy if one has reason to be happy, and good to be unhappy if and only if one has good reason to be unhappy. So once again, the thesis is, it's good to be happy if one has reason to be happy, and it's good to be unhappy if and only if one has good reason to be unhappy. And the latter part of this thesis, that it's good to be unhappy if and only if one has good reason to be unhappy, this part of the thesis puts MacIntyre at odds with the dominant conception of happiness, which sees happiness as an unqualified good. But what about those people in the psychological surveys that the psychologists that do these happiness studies, or I suppose economists, sociologists do them too, I imagine, but mainly in psychology, so-called positive psychology. They do these psychological surveys where they ask people, are you happy? And they try to correlate, of course, various features of people's lives with whether they're happy or not, and discover what the conditions of happiness are. So people fill out these psychological surveys, and they respond and they say, I'm happy. Are some of them possibly mistaken? Do they not have reasons for their happiness? MacIntyre suggests that they may have reasons, yet not sufficient reasons. There is such a thing as an illusion of being happy that's brought on by low expectations, like the Danes, for example, that is, residents of Denmark, who report on them being happy, but this appears to correlate with their especially low expectations for life. Maybe they've been reading too much Kierkegaard, I don't know. Or from a lack of hope. That is, you might be happy with a very desperate lot, like the chronically poor sometimes are. It reminds me of the theme to the 1970s sitcom Good Times. You can look up the lyrics to that example of being happy, thinking that these are good times because of just a kind of a hopelessness of the chronically destitute or desperate. People may also be pleased by things that they do not have reason to be pleased by. For example, the misfortunes of others, and they may recognize this. So it's possible for you to be happy and kind of wish you weren't happy. Today was a good day. My next door neighbor who's been ticking me off all winter or whatever. Maybe they've been blowing the snow into my yard or something and ticking me off. And this person, they had an accident and their snowblower injured them or something. Now they're in the hospital. And I'm just pleased as punch by that. I'm just really happy. But then also when I reflect, I think, I really shouldn't be happy. I wish I wasn't made happy by this, but I am happy by this. So things can be more complicated. You can be happy, and yet even you yourself recognize that you shouldn't be, you wish you weren't. So MacIntyre concludes on page 200 here, second paragraph. To have it as one's aim to make people happier, whether they have reason to be so or not, is therefore never justified. Unhappiness with this or that aspect of our condition is often better for us than happiness. The dominant conception of happiness refutes this fact, which is rather obvious on reflection, MacIntyre thinks. Sometimes it's better for us to be unhappy rather than happy. How does the dominant conception of happiness miss such an obvious fact? Well, it's because it takes for granted the dominant economic conception of practical rationality that we talked about at the end of the last video, which sees agents exclusively as directed towards the satisfying of their desires and maximal preference satisfaction. So if that's the dominant conception of rationality, then being satisfied, having your preferences satisfied, finding your life to be agreeable and your desires to be fulfilled would always be a good thing. But from the Aristotelian perspective, things look different. The Aristotelian is opposed to this preference satisfaction view of happiness in a few respects. First, from the Aristotelian, and again, this is largely a review of our discussion of happiness in the Nicomachean Ethics. To be happy for the Aristotelian is to be conceived as engaging in worthwhile kinds of activity, leading to a life worth living. To be happy is to be conceived as engaging in worthwhile kinds of activity, leading to a life worth living. Second, what you take pleasure in is determined by what kind of person you are and what sort of virtues you have. This is a matter of achieving those distinctive excellences of human beings. So those are the two conceptions, aspects, the first two aspects, at least, of the conception of happiness that's characteristic of the Aristotelian as opposed to the dominant conception, that happiness is conceived as engaging in worthwhile kinds of activity, leading to a life worth living. And what you take pleasure in is determined what kind of person you are, what sort of virtues you have, which is a matter of achieving those distinctive excellences of human beings. So not all kinds of pleasure constitutes happiness. It's only the kinds of pleasure that are rooted in the virtues, the pleasures of the virtuous person, the pleasures that are rooted in the achievement of human excellences of one kind or another. Those are the pleasures that are constitutive of happiness, not just any and every pleasure. This alternative conception has a long history, of course, and it's still presupposed by a wide range of activities, responses, and judgments, says MacIntyre. We still understand this, we can still appreciate this as an alternative conception of happiness to the one that says happiness is just the subjective psychological state of having your preferences satisfied. In sum, on the Aristotelian view, unhappiness is often appropriate, and it's often better to be unhappy according to the modern standard of happiness. And this is because the truer standard of happiness, the standard of happiness that's truer to human nature, is one that views happiness as engaging in worthwhile activities, leading a worthwhile life, and taking pleasure in those things that are characteristic of the virtuous person. So this leads to the first discussion question. In what ways, if at all, is the Aristotelian conception of happiness that MacIntyre advocates more adequate than the dominant modern conception? Is happiness merely a subjective mental state, or does it depend on the actual achievement of actual goods? Justify your answer. Once again, the first discussion question. In what ways, if at all, is the Aristotelian conception of happiness that MacIntyre advocates more adequate than the dominant modern conception? Is happiness merely a subjective mental state, or does it depend upon the actual achievement of actual goods? Justify your answer. Okay. Section 8. Some contemporary conflicts and incoherences. MacIntyre has been working toward giving an account of how the Thomistic Aristotelian theorist will justify his moral claims. And now he's almost at the point where he's prepared to sketch an account of rational justification according to the Thomistic Aristotelian ethical theory. However, it's useful to ask, under what conditions is it necessary to offer a justification of moral claims in general and of theoretical claims about morality in particular? The example of the Chicago school closures in 2013 provides a kind of case study for MacIntyre about how such questions about justification of moral claims can arise and how they might be linked to theoretical claims in ethical theory. Here we find a prime example of the competition and conflict between efficiency and utility on the one hand versus the common goods that the schools provided their local communities on the other. So recall the example of the case here is a standard example that you see all over the place. You see this with church closing, parish closings, as well as with school closings, hospital closings, where this institution that served as a unifying force within the community, as schools do, and especially in these low-income neighborhoods, are being closed in the names of efficiency and cost effectiveness, without regard to the common goods that the schools provided to their local communities as a focal point of community life. And so there's this struggle between the school board and the city of Chicago on the one hand, who were informed by the economic mode of thinking, the mode of thinking of economic rationality on the one hand, and then the local community who were informed by Thomistic Aristotelian rationality, centered on the certain ideas of the common goods of the community and of the human beings who were participating in that community. This was an example of how the judgments of the imposed parties were informed by the two incompatible modes of thinking that MacIntyre described earlier, economic rationality versus Thomistic Aristotelian rationality. The problem is that these two modes of practical outlook are radically distinct. And when forced to choose sides, people are naturally left at a loss about how to decide between them. Then how would the Thomistic Aristotelian theorist proceed to justify her particular Thomistic Aristotelian moral judgments in particular situations? Here MacIntyre makes his first remarks about the tasks of rational justification, as he calls it. The first task is to get to know your audience. The first task of rational justification, get to know your audience. Who are you trying to justify a moral claim to? What are their relevant beliefs, attitudes, commitments, and capacities? In general, quoting here from page 205 at the top, to justify some claim, whether mathematical, scientific, theological, or political and moral, to justify some claim is to show to someone that their present beliefs, attitudes, and commitments are such that their capacity to recognize certain truths is such, to show someone that their present beliefs, attitudes, and commitments are such, and their capacity to recognize certain truths is such, that on reflection they cannot, without some greater or lesser inconsistency, reject that claim. Complicated syntax, or idiosyncratic MacIntyrean syntax there. But the idea is that we justify a claim by showing that this person has beliefs or attitudes or commitments or recognizes, admits certain truths that make it logically impossible for them to reject the claim that you're trying to justify. So justify a claim to someone, you need something to work with. You need to know what you're working with. You need to know what do they believe, what are their attitudes, what are their commitments. And if you can show that they're being inconsistent, that they're going to have some cognitive dissonance if they reject the claim that you're advancing, because the claim that you're advancing is something that logically they cannot reject, given their beliefs, attitudes, and commitments. So it's crucial here that you need something to work with. The person has to have some beliefs, attitudes, and commitments that are, in fact, inconsistent with the claim you're advancing. And if they don't, then you're kind of up a creek without a paddle. We all know that there's wide-ranging disagreement across cultures and classes and parties over how to rank various human goods. So we have to know that there's something in the beliefs of the person that we're trying to justify our claim to that will make them open to considering our claim. And across very wide divergences in rankings of human goods, it may be that there's not enough common ground to justify a moral claim to a particular person. And this is why I think in the background here, MacIntyre might even be thinking of this. Oftentimes in traditional ethical theory, you get this idea that in order for your judgment to be rationally justified, your moral judgment, your political judgment to be rationally justified, you should have to be able to convince a committed Nazi, right, of your moral claim. And essentially, MacIntyre is saying this is just not a realistic standard. You have to have some presumed shared background of beliefs, attitudes, and so forth. And maybe, it might even be possible that in some cases there is such a thing in the case of the Nazi. I already mentioned the way in which, the typical Nazi oftentimes had a kind of compartmentalized life, a life that was not unified and integral in any way. But they had one set of values for their family life, for example, and another set of values for their professional life. So it may be that there's some purchase that can be gained from relying upon values that they have in one's sphere. But you need to know that there's something in the beliefs of the person that you're trying to justify your claim to that will make them open to considering your claim. So that's the basic first condition of the task of rational justification, is finding out what the person believes and knowing what you can appeal to and justify your claim in that way. To find out whether there's something there, we will need to engage in a dialogue with that person. So dialogue and conversation, getting to know the person, getting to know their beliefs is essential to rational justification. Section 9, how Thomistic Aristotelians justify their claims in contemporary debate. Issues of rational justification. So how would a Thomistic Aristotelian justify their moral claims? Well, it depends. The first major divide is between answering the theoretical questions of the philosopher and answering the practical questions of the agent. The theoretical questions of the philosopher versus the practical questions of the agent. So take the philosopher's questions first. Here there's another division between justifying particular actions from within the theory's presuppositions. So we might say, for example, how would a Thomistic Aristotelian justify a prohibition against discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation? How would a Thomistic Aristotelian do that? Or could a Thomistic Aristotelian do that? So there's that kind of idea, this particular action. Or that's maybe more of a policy. So think about, a particular action. How would a Thomistic Aristotelian justify the action of, breaking off the conversation in order to save the child from the oncoming car in MacIntyre's earlier example? So how would the Thomistic Aristotelian justify that action from within the theory's presupposition? Typically, these kinds of actions, of course, aren't the ones that need to be justified. It's the more controversial ones that would be pressed upon the theorist to show how they could be justified from within this framework. So that's one type of question, theoretical question, justify particular actions from within the theoretical framework. The second would be justifying the theoretical framework itself as the quote-unquote correct theoretical framework. Although that's the kind of language, as we'll see, that MacIntyre is reluctant to use, the correct theoretical framework. The most basic justification is really the latter. How do I justify Thomistic Aristotelianism as a scheme, as an ethical theory? How will one provide a justification of the Thomistic Aristotelian theory? Well, MacIntyre explains this. I'm going to quote quite a bit here. This is on page 206, beginning about a dozen lines down. When that scheme, the Thomistic Aristotelian scheme, is itself put in question, their arguments will be of a different kind. What they need to provide and can provide is an historical narrative, one that begins from Aristotle's responses to his predecessors, to the pre-Socratic thinkers, to Socrates and to Plato, from Aristotle's reformulations of their questions, his criticisms of their theses and arguments, and his development of their lines of thought. There emerged a systematic set of inquiries, each with some bearing on at least some of the others. To be an Aristotelian is to participate in these inquiries, and at each stage of its subsequent history, Aristotelians have had to confront multifarious problems: how to resolve incoherences internal to the system, how to accommodate new discoveries, how to respond to objections from rival schools of thought, when to abandon certain inquiries as sterile. So Aristotelians have, in their commentaries, recurrently revisited Aristotle's texts with new insights and resources, and have reframed Aristotle's theses and arguments in light of the encounters, first with Islamic and Jewish philosophical theism, then with 13th century Augustinianism, and later still with various protagonists of modern philosophy. What Aquinas provides is a radical restatement of Aristotelianism, one that, while still theistic, returned his 13th century contemporaries to the original Aristotle in a new way. After him, the work of elucidation and critique continued, through periods in which Thomists have had to confront objections and problems posed successively by the new understanding of law and morals that finds expression in the making of the modern state, by the new anti-Aristotelian natural science, by the Enlightenment, and by post-Kantian philosophy. What we have now is, so the Thomistic Aristotelian claims, so the Neo-Aristotelian claim runs, what we have now is the best statement of the theory so far, as judged by the best criteria of truth and rational justification that have emerged so far, one whose protagonists have been able to make at least an adequate rejoinder to the principal objection so far advanced against it. So the question you may have forgotten by this point is, how will one provide a justification of the Thomistic Aristotelian theory? And MacIntyre's answer is, well, we'll tell this long story, much of which he told in this work, Whose Justice, Which Rationality, which he's partially recounting here. But it's a particular type of narrative. It's a narrative story that shows how the theory emerged into its present form under the pressure of dialectical exchanges with opponents to the theory, as well as under the pressure of various contending interpretations of the theory from within the theory itself, and attempts to work out incoherences or tensions, logical tensions within the theory. And out of that whole process emerged the present version of the theory. But what does telling this narrative story accomplish for you? I thought he was going to explain how one justifies Thomistic Aristotelian theory. How does telling the history of how it developed and evolved into what it is now do that? Isn't this just an admission that he can't justify it? Would a scientist say this about his or her theory? No. So doesn't this show that ethical theory is just what an expressivist says it is? Just an expression of pre-rational impulse and maybe taste? Someone has a taste for this kind of theory or whatever? A particular yen for Aristotle? Well, to appreciate why these questions are not to the point, one needs to disabuse oneself, first of all, I think, of a popular but misguided view of scientific theories as theories that are validated by the data. Since Nelson Goodman, this famous work, Fact, Fiction, and Forecasts, those of you might be familiar with this, we've known that data always underdetermines what, or overdetermines what theory is supposed to accommodate the data. So there are always multiple incompatible theories that can equally well account for the data. So the choice between theories can't be settled just by reference to the data alone. There has to be something more involved. Enter Thomas Kuhn's groundbreaking work, and this is in the background of MacIntyre's view of rational justification here, to Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Since this work has been generally acknowledged that the standards by which scientific theories are accepted are the outcome of a historical process that has all the particularities of any other historical process. So, for example, just as to understand why certain political arguments gain traction, say in Alabama, certain political arguments gain traction in Alabama that perhaps wouldn't gain traction somewhere else, to understand why they gain traction, you need to know something about the political history of Alabama. And similarly, to understand why scientists accept Einsteinian relativity, you can't just say, well, the data shows this. You need to understand something about the history of physics. Now, this does not mean that there's no genuine rational progress, either in Alabama politics or in physical science. It just means that the standards that measure progress are themselves internal to the history of those practices. That is, to understand why the standards that determine what theory is better than another theory, or what political argument is better than another political argument, and what theories are no longer in bounds, or what political arguments are no longer in bounds at this point in history, to understand why the standards that determine that are what they are, you need to understand the history of the practice. And that will make clear how these standards emerged as the rational standards that today determine these theories are acceptable, these are not. The standards are standards that emerge in the process of dealing with certain previous problems. The standards emerged as ways to deal with those problems. And I'm sorry I have to remain so abstract, but I recommend, you can read Structure of Scientific Revolutions and other texts filling in some of the details of this. But the point is that the standards that measure progress are internal to the history of these practices to see why something counts as the best theory or argument. According to these standards, you have to understand how these standards emerged in the course of the debates and the conflicts of the past. And that's why history matters to theory justification, whether in science or in ethics. And this is what MacIntyre is referring to when he refers to the best statement of the theory so far as judged by the best criteria and truth. Well, what makes them the best? What makes them the best is that these are the ones that have emerged out of the past debates as the ones that have allowed us to resolve the most conflicts and intellectual conflicts we're talking about now in the past debates. So the fullest defense of Thomistic Aristotelian theory in particular would require a different kind of book. Something like this book that would take the form of a structured history of the debates that different versions of the theory have found themselves in, and how this led to the emergence of certain standards of success, how the theory was refined in response to those challenges, and conclusions regarding what has emerged as the best version of the theory up to this point. So MacIntyre is not giving this here. He's just giving us a sense of what the structure of justification would be. He's not actually giving the justification, because that would require writing the history of Aristotelian ethics and showing how the current version of the theory and the standards and so forth apply the best insights of this history. But this would perhaps only be the first stage, because Thomistic Aristotelianism faces challenges from rival traditions of ethical theory. And so the question of which framework is better arises. Across theories, the standards of success are likely to be understood differently, since, for example, utilitarianism, consequentialist theory and tradition, has a different history from Thomistic Aristotelianism. So there's a potential problem of incommensurability, incommensurable standards. And once again, MacIntyre has something to say about how to proceed in such disputes. He dealt with this in detail in this work, Three Rival Versions of Moral Inquiry. And he recaps some of this here. But for the more detailed account of this, if you're interested, you could go here. How you deal with rival traditions of moral inquiry when they have incommensurable standards and separate and divergent histories. How do you deal with these, the conflict between these different traditions? Here, however, he appears to be more interested in appealing to particular critics, not qua advocate of this or that theory, but qua human being and practical agent. The articulation of the theory itself will depend upon connecting theoretical concepts with the practical context that gives them their sense, as MacIntyre to some extent has already been doing, connecting theoretical concepts with the practical context that gives them their sense. Once we move into the domain of the practical application of theory, we move into the employment of a second type of narrative, the first personal narrative, which is, in MacIntyre's words, quote, a history of the development and exercise of a particular agent's rational powers, and of how that agent learned to rank order goods. So a narrative of my particular moral development, moral history, my moral growth would be one way to think about this. That's where the practical application of history sort of comes into the picture of justification. MacIntyre regards the experience of a breakdown in the compartmentalization of their lives as one typical starting point for learning how to rank order goods in our culture. For example, if one is professionally required to tell a truth that from the perspective of a friendship will be seen as a betrayal. Gives this sort of example. I imagine here a situation where, one knows some indiscretions of one's friend and coworker, let's say, and one has to appear before one's boss or a board of inquiry or something, and is faced with the conflict of sort of performing one's duty as a professional and telling the truth versus keeping one's friend's secret. That's an example of situations that force a breakdown of the compartmentalization in which we can normally live. I'm normally truthful in my professional life, but I keep my friends' secrets. But in this situation, they come into conflict. And there are many such cases, of course, we can imagine. MacIntyre seems to think that at this historical cultural moment in the modern world, we're prompted by the conflicts within morality itself, on the one hand, between the deontological and the consequentialist strains within morality itself, morality with a capital M, and also between the ethics of the state and market on the one hand and the lingering Thomistic Aristotelian forms of society and rationality. Those were prompted by those conflicts to theoretical reflection. That is, there's something about this historical moment and the conflicts that are within our society's practice of morality itself that lead us to theoretical reflection. And this theoretical reflection leads to the types of questions that Thomistic Aristotelianism is suited to answer. For instance, in the conflict between my understanding of my duty as a friend and my understanding of my duty as a professional, I find myself needing to ask questions about what goods are to be found in each of these roles, and how these goods relate to the good of a human being in general. In response to such questions, the agent has to engage in inquiries and deliberations that will have to become more and more theoretical. To justify the outcome of such inquiries and deliberations, the agent will have to appeal, MacIntyre thinks, to the narrative of her life. How did I come to have confidence in the judgments and the dispositions that I arrived at through a process of deliberation, trial, and error in the course of my life? And so there are two parallel justificatory narratives in MacIntyre's scheme. Justificatory narratives. First, there's the one that spells out the history of the Thomistic Aristotelian ethics, that spells out how it arrived at the particular formulation that represents the best statement of the theory so far. That's one justificatory narrative, the kind that I'm suggesting he provides to some extent, or begins to provide in this book, about Thomistic Aristotelianism. And then second, the one that the agent is engaged in, the justificatory narrative that I as an agent am engaged in when I apply this theory to my life. When I'm engaging in an attempt to reason how to best order the goods that my life involves. The point that MacIntyre wants to make is that when a practical agent whose actions and practical reasoning embody a Thomistic Aristotelian conception of agency is challenged with the question, why do you act the way you do in such and such situation? Why do you act the way you do in such and such situation? The reply is not going to be to resort to theory, but to tell the story of their life. Page 209, whatever in it is relevant to explaining how their exercise of practical intelligence is informed by what they learned from their previous mistakes in identifying the kind of situation that they are now in and the goods that are at stake in it. Why did you act the way you do? Why did you do what you did in this situation? And you basically have to explain yourself in terms of the process of deliberation that led to that, based upon what you've learned from your life experience. That's what he's describing here. MacIntyre says that the agent can be defeated in their attempts to justify themselves. That's his word, defeated. Only if the reasons that they adduce for acting the way they do are not good reasons according to their own standards. Or if the standards they're appealing to are the wrong standards to appeal to in this situation, in light of some of the other considerations that they're committed to acknowledging. At the theoretical level, the challenge to some central thesis of Thomistic Aristotelianism will, as already stated, have to be met by appealing to the resources found within the history of the theory. Beyond this, objectors can only hope to give the strongest objections they can, as to why the Thomistic Aristotelian theorists should reconsider their acceptance of that theory, of Thomistic Aristotelianism. If the Thomistic Aristotelian theorist remains unconvinced after giving these due considerations, then the only remaining questions concern the nature of the mistakes made by those critics and why their objections are found compelling by those who advance them. Incommensurable theoretical perspectives can also be compared and assessed by how convincing each perspective can be in explaining from their own perspective the errors of the other. And this will involve what MacIntyre called sociological self-knowledge. He explains this as follows, page 211. To have sociological self-knowledge is to know who you and those around you are in terms of their roles and relationships to each other, to the common goods of the family, workplace, and school, and to the structures through which power and money are distributed. It is to understand what in those roles and relationships is consonant with the exercise of rational agency, and what through the contingencies of an imposed set of structures inhibits or distorts that exercise. MacIntyre is clear here that he's not talking about theoretical knowledge, or rather, quote, a kind of self-knowledge characteristically exhibited in and presupposed by the everyday reasoning of many agents, unquote, page 212. This is the knowledge of how the dominant social order shapes relationships and ideas of success, how it governs what conversations may be had and what topics discussed and with whom. It's to understand such things as how jokes and satire are one thing, effective action aimed at the redistribution of power and money is quite another. And it also involves the ability to imagine alternative social structures. MacIntyre summarizes the kind of sociological self-knowledge he's talking about as follows on page 213. To have sociological self-knowledge is then to have a grasp of the nature of the roles and relationships in which one is involved, of the shared assumptions of those with whom one interacts, of what in those roles, relationships, and assumptions obstructs the exercise of rational agency, and of what the possibilities are of acting so as to transform them. MacIntyre clearly believes that the acquisition of such sociological self-knowledge should be the aim of civic education, or equivalent of Aristotle's notion of moral education. We should all be concerned about being open to the charge that we act as we do because of some lack of sociological self-knowledge. And then finally, section 10, the relevance of the virtues understood in Aristotelian and Thomistic terms. We've seen how for MacIntyre, the conflicts of modernity are conflicts between the aim of maximizing preference satisfaction and the aim of achieving the common good of some community. He thinks the goal for the Thomistic Aristotelian in these conflicts is to open up possibilities of shared rational deliberation about the achievement of common goods. So in these conflicts of modernity between economic rationality and the Thomistic Aristotelian rationality, the goal for the Thomistic Aristotelian is to open up possibilities of shared rational deliberation about the achievement of common goods. Furthermore, he thinks that if you view the goal in such conflicts as that of opening up shared rational deliberation about the achievement of common goods, then you are, whether you realize it or not, presupposing the truth of the Thomistic Aristotelian account of the human condition, as he calls it. That is, people like the Thorup Strand Fishers, the Monte Azul community organizers, and the Chicago advocates for keeping inner-city schools slated for closing open are de facto or implicit Thomistic Aristotelians, even though, of course, they don't realize it. Why are they de facto or implicit Thomistic Aristotelians? Because their goal is to keep open the possibilities of shared rational deliberation about the achievement of common goods. If they conceive of themselves as having the powers and potentialities of rational agents, and they conceive of themselves as rank ordering goods as rational agents do, and as needing the virtues to develop and exercise these powers, then by MacIntyre's lights, they are implicit or de facto Thomistic Aristotelians. So you might be a Thomistic Aristotelian and not know it if you conceive of yourself as a rational agent, rank ordering goods as rational agents do, and as needing the virtues to develop and exercise these powers. And so you see the last one is crucial and key, because even the preference maximizer, the economic rationalist, could conceive of themselves as being a rational agent, of course, and rank ordering goods as rational agents do. But they wouldn't count as a Thomistic Aristotelian because they don't think that they need the virtues to develop and exercise those powers. Such agents, that is, Thomistic Aristotelian agents, will find the vocabulary of the virtues to be justified as applied to and within their own practice of the virtues. This vocabulary is what best makes sense of their moral experience and their progress in developing their rational, moral, and political capacities. So in telling oneself the narrative of one's life, you can say, looking back, I really was courageous in making that decision I did at that time. That was a very prudent action that I took. I showed quite a bit of self-control, moderation, and temperance in restraining myself from pursuing this particular temptation, and so forth. So this language, the Thomistic Aristotelian theoretical language describing human agency, is justified within such a narrative by its efficaciousness in furthering the self-understanding of human beings who act in accordance with the way in which the Thomistic Aristotelian vocabulary describes human beings. It's a given that from the Thomistic Aristotelian perspective, an agent's decisions will be shaped by the agent's virtues or lack of them. In particular, common goods will, for the virtuous agent, provide more heavily weighing reasons than for the non-virtuous agent. The exercise of the virtues can make a life intelligible if the particular exercise of the virtues by a particular person in a particular context can be seen as contributing to the overall directedness of his or her life. Thus, for MacIntyre, to evaluate actions and persons in terms of their virtues and vices presupposes a narrative understanding of the human life. And this leads us to our second and concluding discussion question. What are the most distinctive differences between the standpoint of the modern preference maximizer and the Thomistic Aristotelian? Does the Thomistic Aristotelian have a superior understanding of human nature and of what is good for human beings, as MacIntyre believes? Does the Thomistic Aristotelian have the resources to justify its view of human nature and of the importance of virtue-centered judgments of actions and persons? Why or why not? So once again, second discussion question. What are the most distinctive differences between the standpoint of the modern preference maximizer and the Thomistic Aristotelian? Does the Thomistic Aristotelian have a superior understanding of human nature and what is good for human beings, as MacIntyre believes? Does the Thomistic Aristotelian have the resources to justify its view of human nature and of the importance of virtue-centered judgments of actions and persons? Why or why not?